There is one of the strangest deaths in English history. A man lost his head not for raising a sword in rebellion, but for using silence to defy a king. Thomas More stepped onto the scaffold with a broken heart, not out of fear, but because the man signing his death warrant was Henry VIII, the soulmate with whom he once talked through the night. It was the brutal tragedy of an intellectual who placed his conscience above the crown, accepting his blood would spill rather than speaking a single lie just to buy a safe life. Behind that historical statue was actually a respectable eccentric. He was the Lord Chancellor, yet his pockets were empty, and he secretly wore an itchy hair shirt underneath to punish his own flesh. He was sharp as a tack, wrote books to subtly mock society, and even at death, he cracked a joke, moving his beard aside so it wouldn't be cut. His life leaves behind a bitter truth. If you want to stand tall in a crowd that is kneeling, sometimes the price you pay is getting that very head chopped off. He was born in 1478 in the heart of London, on Milk Street in Cheapside. This wasn't the London of Shakespeare, not yet. That explosion of poetry and theater was still a century away. This was a medieval city, a walled fortress of wood and stone, still recovering from the bloody scars of the Wars of the Roses. The crown had only just settled on the head of Henry VII, the first Tudor king, ending decades of civil war. It was a time of immense grinding transition. The air was filled with the sound of church bells, hundreds of them, marking the canonical hours. The Catholic Church was not just a religion. It was the atmosphere. It was the calendar, the court, the hospital, and the school. It was the universal truth that held the world together. But the old medieval order, with its certainty and its hierarchy, was beginning to crack. From the south, from Italy, a new wind was blowing. The Renaissance was drifting north, bringing with it a rediscovery of Greek, of philosophy, of human potential. It was a dangerous, exciting time where the stroke of a pen could be as deadly as the stroke of a sword. New ideas were challenging old dogmas. The printing press was beginning to churn out books, spreading knowledge and heresy faster than the church could control. Thomas More was born right into the center of this friction. He was the son of Sir John More, a successful lawyer and later a judge. John More was a man of the new era, pragmatic, sharp, ambitious, and utterly unsentimental. He was a man of the law. He viewed the world through contracts, statutes, and property rights. He had a very specific plan for his son. He wanted Thomas to follow the safe, lucrative path of the courts. He wanted him to be rich, powerful, and influential. But young Thomas was different. He was brilliant, yes, possessed of a mind that soaked up information like a sponge, but he was also possessed by a deep, almost frightening piety. While his father looked at the statutes of England, Thomas looked at the laws of God. At the tender age of 12, thanks to his father's connections, Thomas was sent to serve as a page in the household of John Morton, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor of England. This was the seat of true power. Morton was a kingmaker, a man who had survived the civil wars to become the right hand of the king. He was a master politician who saw everything, and Morton saw something in the young Thomas More. The boy was not just a servant, he was a prodigy. It is said that during the lavish dinner parties, Morton threw for the nobility. The young boy would step in among the actors, performing interludes for the guests. Without a script, without rehearsal, Thomas would improvise, dazzling the room with a wit so sharp and a timing so perfect that he outshone the professional players. Morton would watch him, amused and impressed. He would tell his powerful guests, pointing to the boy clearing the plates, "This child here waiting at the table, whosoever shall live to see it, will prove a marvelous man." It was a prophecy, but it was also a curse, because that marvelous man was internally torn apart. After studying at Oxford, where he fell in love with Greek and the new humanist learning, where he tasted the forbidden fruit of intellectual freedom, his father yanked him back to London. Sir John Moore had no patience for Greek philosophy or poetry. Those were hobbies for starving scholars, not for a future judge. Thomas was forced to study law at Lincoln's Inn. He obeyed. He was a dutiful son. He mastered the law with an ease that frustrated his peers. He became a rising star in the legal world of London, but his heart remained in the cloister. For 4 years, while training to be a high-flying lawyer, Moore lived a secret double life that terrified his father. He moved his lodgings near the Carthusian monastery, the Charter House. The Carthusians were the strictest order in the church, men who lived in silence and solitude, dedicated entirely to prayer and penance. This is a detail that often gets glossed over in the history books, but it is the key to his psychology. It explains everything that happened later. While his peers were drinking, gambling, and carousing in the taverns of London, Thomas More was in his room, wearing a hair shirt. This was a rough, scratchy garment made of coarse horsehair, worn directly next to the skin. It chafed. It drew blood. It was designed to irritate the flesh constantly, to remind the wearer of Christ's suffering, and to suppress the desires of the body. He scourged himself. He fasted until he was faint. He prayed for hours, sleeping on the cold floor with a log for a pillow. He was testing himself. He was standing on the precipice, looking down into the life of a monk, trying to decide whether to abandon the world completely. He was terrified of his own sexuality, of his own ambition, of his own humanity. He wanted to be pure. In the end, he chose the world, but for a very human reason. As he later admitted to his friend Erasmus, he decided to be a chaste husband rather than an impure priest. He knew his own nature. He knew he could not conquer his desire for a family, for companionship, for a wife. He realized he could not sustain the celibacy required of the priesthood without falling into sin. So in 1505, he turned away from the Charter House. He married Jane Colt. It was a happy match, a love match in many ways, producing 4 children. But the monastery never really left him. Beneath the lawyer's robes, beneath the velvet chain of office he would later wear, the hair shirt remained. He lived in the world. He laughed. He argued cases. He wrote books. But he was never quite of the world. He was a man walking through a banquet hall, secretly wearing armor against the pleasures of the feast. Yet this secret discipline did not make him dour. Rather, it seemed to fuel a manic, brilliant energy that he now poured into the creation of his own private kingdom. Having stepped back from the brink of the monastery, More determined that if he could not live in the house of God, he would build a house of God within the world. Thomas More's decision to leave the monastery and enter the world was not a retreat from God. It was an attempt to find God in the chaos of daily life. And for a time, he succeeded brilliantly. He created a domestic world that was unlike anything England had ever seen, a Christian academy disguised as a family home. He settled first in Bucklersbury and later in a sprawling, beautiful house in Chelsea, just up the river from the city's smoke and noise. It was here that the true character of the man flourished. If you were a scholar in Europe in the early 16th century, Thomas More's house was not just a destination. It was a pilgrimage site. His greatest friend, the man who understood his soul better perhaps than even his wives, was the Dutch humanist Desiderius Erasmus. They were soulmates of the mind. They met in 1499 and fell into an immediate, lifelong intellectual romance. They wrote to each other constantly, their letters filled with wit, Greek puns, and deep theological musings. It is a testament to their bond that Erasmus wrote his most famous work, In Praise of Folly, while staying as a guest in More's house. The title in Latin, Encomium Moriae, is a deliberate, affectionate pun on More's name. To Erasmus, More was the wisest fool in Christendom. But the heart of the Chelsea house was not the famous guests, it was the children. More was a revolutionary father. In an era when women were considered intellectually inferior, meant only to sew, manage a household, and look pretty, More did something radical. He gave his 3 daughters the exact same rigorous classical education as his son. He hired the best tutors. He taught them Greek, Latin, astronomy, and philosophy. He told them that virtue and intelligence were the only things that mattered, regardless of gender. His eldest daughter, Margaret, Meg, as he tenderly called her, became his masterpiece. She was brilliant, arguably as smart as her father, and their bond was profound. It was a connection of intellect and soul that would become the emotional anchor of his life and the source of his greatest pain when the end finally came. Yet tragedy struck this paradise early. His beloved first wife, Jane, the little wife he had molded and loved, died young in 1511, leaving him with 4 small children. The house was plunged into grief. But More's response was shockingly pragmatic, a testament to the hard-headed lawyer beneath the humanist dreamer. Within a month, he remarried. He chose Alice Middleton, a wealthy widow 7 years his senior. Dame Alice was everything Jane was not. She was not a scholar. She had no interest in Greek or Latin. She was sharp-tongued, practical, bustling, and often baffled by her husband's lack of ambition for wealth. She famously scolded him for not aggressively pursuing better fees. But she ran his household with a firm hand. She cared for his children as her own, and she grounded him. When Thomas gazed too long at the stars or got lost in philosophical abstractions, Dame Alice was there to remind him of the price of bread and the need to fix the roof. She was the anchor to his kite. By his early 40s, Thomas More was a star in the European firmament. He was a successful under-sheriff of London, a member of Parliament, and a celebrated author. In 1516, he published the work that would etch his name into history forever, Utopia. It is a strange, enigmatic little book. Even today, scholars argue about what More actually meant. In it, he imagines a traveler describing an island society in the New World. In Utopia, a Greek pun meaning no place, there is no private property. Everyone wears the same simple clothes. Men and women are educated alike. There is religious tolerance. Gold is despised and used to make chamber pots. It was a biting, hilarious satire of the greed, corruption, and vanity of his own Europe. It attacked the enclosure of land by the rich, the hanging of thieves, and the arrogance of kings. It is ironic and perhaps telling that the man who described a communist paradise is honored today by the Catholic Church, while his ideas on communal ownership later earned him a place of honor on a monument in Soviet Moscow. Was he serious? Or was it a massive, sophisticated joke? Perhaps it was both, a dream of what the world could be, written by a man who knew exactly how broken the world actually was. But More could not stay in his library writing satires. The orbit of the king was too strong. Henry VIII in these early years was not the bloated tyrant of his later portraits. He was young, athletic, golden-haired, and deeply intellectual. He fancied himself a Renaissance prince. He wanted the smartest men in England around him to dazzle foreign ambassadors and to stimulate his own mind. He wanted Thomas More. For years, More resisted. He knew that court life was a viper's nest of flattery and deceit. He wanted to be a free citizen, not a servant. But Henry was persistent. He charmed More. He offered him positions of increasing power. Finally, In 1518, More entered the king's service as a privy councillor. They seemed for a time to be friends. Witnesses described seeing the King of England arriving unannounced at the house in Chelsea for dinner. They would walk in the gardens for hours, the king's arm draped casually, affectionately, around Thomas More's neck as they debated theology and astronomy. It looked like favor. It looked like safety. It looked like the pinnacle of success. But Thomas More was not fooled. He had the cold, clear eye of a man who watched the tides. One day, his son-in-law, William Roper, congratulated him on the king's extraordinary love. More turned to him, his face grave, and replied with a chilling foresight that haunts the history books. I believe he doth as singularly favor me as any subject within this realm. Howbeit, son Roper, I may tell thee, I have no cause to be proud thereof. For if my head could win him a castle in France, it should not fail to go. He knew. Even then, in the golden sunshine of Henry's favor, he knew. To Henry, people were useful only as long as they were useful. They were tools, and tools can be discarded. And then the world broke. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, and the Protestant Reformation exploded. For Thomas More, this wasn't just a theological disagreement or a debate about indulgences. It was the end of civilization. More was a man of order. He believed deeply, passionately, in the unity of Christendom. He believed that the church, for all its flaws, and he knew them well, he had mocked them himself in his writings, was the only thing holding back the dark tide of chaos. If you remove the authority of the church, he believed, you open the door to anarchy. If every man could interpret the Bible for himself, then truth would shatter into a million pieces. He looked at Germany and saw peasant revolts, war, and the destruction of the soul. He was terrified. The man for all seasons, the humanist who wrote of tolerance and utopia, now underwent a dark transformation. He became the king's hammer against heresy. This is the shadow over More's legacy, the part that is hardest for modern admirers to reconcile. But to understand him, we must see that his intolerance was born of fear for the souls of his countrymen. He despised William Tyndale, the man trying to translate the Bible into English. To us, Tyndale is a hero of literacy. To More, he was a seducer of souls, twisting Scripture to mislead the ignorant into hellfire. More unleashed his pen, writing nearly 500,000 words of vicious, scatological attacks, calling Tyndale and Luther apes, drunkards, and hellhounds. But it went beyond words. In 1529, the mighty Cardinal Wolsey fell from power, unable to secure the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII turned to Thomas More. He made him Lord Chancellor, the first layman to hold the post in over a century. It was the highest office in the land, and More used it to wage war on heresy. During his chancellorship, 6 heretics were burned at the stake. More defended these executions. He argued that it was better to cut off a gangrenous limb than let the infection kill the whole body. There were whispers, dark rumors spread by Protestant writers like John Fox, that More tortured men in his own garden at Chelsea, whipping them against a tree. More denied this vehemently, admitting only to disciplining a child and a lunatic for public disturbance. But the image of the humanist scholar, the man who loved Erasmus, overseeing the burning of men like John Bainham, remains a stark, uncomfortable contradiction. He was a man terrified of the chaos he saw coming, and he was willing to be ruthless to stop it. He believed he was saving souls from eternal damnation. But the chaos wasn't just coming from Germany. It was growing in the king's own heart. And this time, More could not burn it away. Henry VIII needed a son. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had produced only a daughter, Mary. Henry became obsessed with Anne Boleyn, a woman with dark eyes and a steely will who refused to be his mistress. She demanded a crown. Henry needed the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine so he could remarry. He expected Thomas More, his friend, his chancellor, his genius, to help him fix it. This was the trap. This was the moment the jaws of history snapped shut. More was a loyal subject. He loved his country, but he believed the Pope was the successor of St. Peter. No king, no parliament could overwrite the law of God. Marriage was a sacrament. As Henry moved to break with Rome, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England, More went silent. He could not support the king, but to speak out was treason. So he tried to walk a razor's edge. He focused on his duties as a judge, clearing the backlog of cases with incredible speed and fairness, while ignoring the great matter of the king's marriage. But silence to Henry VIII was not enough. The king didn't just want obedience, he wanted validation. He was a man plagued by a fragile conscience, and he needed the most respected man in Europe to say, "You are right, Henry, you are good." The pressure mounted. The court became a dangerous place. Friends turned into spies. Every word More spoke was analyzed for treason. On May 16th, 1532, the convocation of the clergy surrendered to the king, effectively giving up their independence to the crown. The next day, Thomas More did the only thing he could. He went to the king in the garden at York Place. He knelt, and he handed back the Great Seal of England. He resigned. He hoped it was over. He hoped to retreat to Chelsea, to his family, to his books, and live out his days as a private citizen, poor but alive. He told his family they would now live on Oxford fare, reducing their lifestyle to the level of students. He joked about their poverty to keep their spirits up. He hoped his silence would protect him. He hoped the king would forget him. But Thomas More was too big to be forgotten. And Anne Boleyn, now rising to the throne, was not a woman who forgave. The resignation of the Lord Chancellorship was meant to be an escape hatch, but it turned out to be a cage. More had hoped that by stripping off the velvet robes of state, he would become invisible to the crown, a forgotten scholar left to tend his garden. He was wrong. In the eyes of a king who demanded total submission, silence was not neutrality. It was a thunderous accusation. When Thomas More returned to his home in Chelsea in May 1532, he found himself in a world that had become dangerously small. He had walked away from the king's side, an act that in itself was viewed with deep suspicion. In the court of Henry VIII, you did not retire. You were either useful or you were a threat. By choosing silence, More had made himself a living monument of dissent. The atmosphere in the More household changed overnight. The grand dinners ceased. The stream of illustrious guests dried up. The family, used to the abundance of a chancellor's income, was suddenly faced with the stark reality of poverty. More called his family together, his wife Alice, his children, and their spouses, and laid out the new reality with a mixture of grim humor and stoic resolve. He told them they had been living high on the hog, first at the level of the king's court, then the Inns of Court. Now, he said, they would have to descend to Oxford fare, the meager rations of university students. And if that became too expensive, they would go begging together at people's doors, singing Salve Regina. Dame Alice was furious. She could not understand why her husband, the most brilliant man in England, would throw away everything for a scruple of conscience. Tilly Valley, she would explode, unable to grasp why he wouldn't just do what the king wanted. To her it was simple. The king was the law. Why must Thomas be so stubborn? But for More, the stakes were not financial, they were eternal. He spent his days writing and praying, preparing his soul for the storm he knew was coming. He began to withdraw from the world, spending hours in his new building, a private chapel and study where he could be alone with his God. He wore the hair shirt more frequently now, a physical reminder of the suffering he anticipated. The king, meanwhile, was not content to let More fade away. Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was proceeding, but the validity of it was questioned across Europe. Henry needed the approval of his former chancellor. More's silence was louder than any scream. It was a conspicuous void. When the rest of the nobility lined up to praise the new queen, More stood absent. The breaking point came in June 1533. Anne Boleyn was to be crowned queen in Westminster Abbey. It was a moment of supreme triumph for the Boleyn faction. Invitations were sent to all the notables of the realm, including Thomas More. He was even sent £20 by the bishops to buy a new gown for the occasion, a bribe, essentially, to ensure he looked the part. More took the money, but he stayed home. It was a calculated, fatal insult. By refusing to attend the coronation, he publicly humiliated the new queen. Anne Boleyn, a woman of fierce intelligence and a temper to match Henry's, was enraged. From that moment on, it was personal. She wanted More destroyed. The king's new right-hand man, Thomas Cromwell, began to weave the net. Cromwell was the dark mirror to More, a low-born, ruthless pragmatist, a genius of administration who viewed the state as a machine to be oiled with efficiency, regardless of morality. He began to look for legal ways to entrap More. First, they tried to pin corruption charges on him, alleging he had taken bribes as a judge. It was laughable. More had been scrupulously honest, famously refusing gifts that other judges accepted as a matter of course. He easily disproved the charges, recounting the details of cases with his photographic memory. Next, they tried to link him to the Holy Maid of Kent, Elizabeth Barton. She was a nun who prophesied that if Henry married Anne, he would die within months. She was eventually executed for treason. More had met her, yes, but he had been terrifyingly careful. He produced copies of his letters to her, in which he strictly advised her to stay out of politics and focus on prayer. He had seen the trap before it was sprung. Cromwell was frustrated. More was too smart, too careful, too legally impenetrable. He was walking through a minefield without setting off a single charge, but Henry VIII had the power to change the landscape of the minefield. In early 1534, Parliament passed the first act of succession. It was the hammer blow. The act declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid, his marriage to Anne valid, and their children the rightful heirs to the throne. But it went further. It required all subjects to swear an oath to uphold the act. The oath itself was the weapon. It contained a preamble that didn't just deal with the succession, which More was willing to accept as Parliament had the right to decide who became king, but explicitly rejected the spiritual authority of the Pope. It demanded that the swearer acknowledge the king as the supreme head of the church. To swear it was to deny the Catholic faith. To refuse it was treason. On April the 12th, 1534, the summons arrived at Chelsea. Thomas More was ordered to appear at Lambeth Palace the next morning to take the oath. That Sunday was a day of quiet agony. More went to church in Chelsea one last time. He sat in his usual pew. He prayed with his family, but the atmosphere was heavy with the knowledge of what the morning would bring. The departure the next day is one of the most poignant scenes in English history. Usually when More left for significant business, his family would walk him to the boat landing, kissing him goodbye. But on this morning he could not bear it. He knew that if he saw their tears, his resolve might crumble. He needed to be made of stone. He refused to let them come beyond the garden gate. He kissed them quickly, pulled the wicket gate shut, and walked alone to the boat where his son-in-law, William Roper, was waiting. The boat pushed off into the Thames. For a long time, More sat in silence, staring at the water, his face heavy with an internal battle that Roper could only guess at. He was wrestling with his fear. He was wrestling with his love for his children. He was wrestling with the temptation to just sign the paper and go home. Then suddenly his demeanor changed. He sat up straighter. The cloud lifted from his face. He turned to Roper and whispered 4 words that signaled the end of his internal war. "Son Roper, the field is won." He did not mean he had won against the king. He meant he had won the battle against himself. He had conquered his fear. He had chosen his soul over his life. At Lambeth Palace, the scene was set for intimidation. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, and Thomas Cromwell sat as commissioners. The halls were filled with clergy busily signing the oath, drinking wine and joking, trying to normalize the capitulation. More was called in. He was the only layman summoned that day. He asked to read the act and the oath. He read them carefully to himself. Then he looked up and said he could not swear it. He did not shout. He did not preach. He simply said, "No." Cromwell and Cranmer were stunned. They tried to argue with him. They pointed out that the entire Parliament, the bishops, and the nobility had sworn. "Do you think you are wiser than all the nobility of the realm?" they asked. More's defense was a masterclass in legal precision. He told them he was willing to swear to the succession of Queen Anne's children. He would not quarrel with the king's politics, but he could not swear to the preamble that denied the Pope's authority. "I do not condemn the conscience of any other man," he said softly, "but my conscience will not save me." They threatened him. They cajoled him. They left him in the garden to think while they processed others, hoping the sight of the complying crowd would break him. It did not. When he was called back in, he refused to explain why he wouldn't swear. This was his great legal shield. Under English law, treason was a positive act. You had to do something or say something treasonous. Silence was not a crime. Qui tate consentire videtur. Silence is taken for consent. As long as he didn't explicitly say, "The king is not the head of the church," they couldn't legally kill him. He was gambling that the law would protect him. It was a desperate, brilliant gamble. The king was enraged by the report from Lambeth. He wanted More destroyed. But Cranmer surprisingly argued for a compromise. Let More swear to the succession, but not the preamble. It would be a propaganda victory to have More's name on the list, even with an asterisk. Henry refused. It was all or nothing. On April 17, 1534, Thomas More was taken to the Tower of London. He was rowed down the river, passing under the London Bridge, where his own head would eventually rot. He was escorted through the Traitor's Gate. The porter at the tower demanded his upper garment as a fee, a humiliation ritual. More, with his irrepressible wit, handed the man his hat. "I am sorry it is no better," he said. The porter, unamused, took his cloak. He was locked in the bell tower. The cell was cold, damp, and dimly lit. The walls were thick stone that wept moisture. This would be his home for the next 15 months. It was here, in the silence of the cell, that the physical dismantling of Thomas More began. His health, never robust, began to fail. He suffered from kidney stones and cramps. His chest plagued him. But while his body withered, his mind sharpened. He used scraps of paper and pieces of coal to write. He wrote prayers. He wrote a treatise called A Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation, a meditation on how to face suffering and death with faith. It is one of the most moving prison works ever written, a man talking himself through the fear of torture. But the greatest torture was not the cold or the hunger. It was the visits from his family. Dame Alice came to see him. She was bewildered. She looked around the filthy cell and then at her husband and snapped, "I marvel that you, that have been always taken for so wise a man, will now so play the fool to lie here in this close filthy prison, and be content to be shut up among mice and rats, when you might be abroad at your liberty. She told him of their nice house in Chelsea, his library, his garden. Why can't you just do what everyone else has done? She pleaded. Moore looked at her with sadness and love. Is not this house, he asked, gesturing to the damp stone walls, as nigh heaven as my own? Alice gave a huff of frustration, Tilly Valley, and turned away. She loved him, but she could not understand him. But it was Margaret, his beloved Meg, who tested him most. She was intelligent enough to argue with him on his own level. She wrote to him and eventually was allowed to visit. She played the devil's advocate. She argued that since his heart was pure, God would forgive him for swearing a false oath under duress. She begged him to think of his children. These visits broke his heart. He wept with her. He held her, but he would not move. He told her that he had calculated the cost. I have not left my conscience at the market, he told her. He explained that a man is his conscience. If he swore falsely, he wouldn't just be saying words. He would be unmaking himself. He would be holding his soul in his hands and letting it fall through his fingers like water. They may have my body, he told her, but they shall not have my soul. The government grew desperate. Moore's silence was becoming a legend. It was embarrassing the king. They needed him to speak. They sent interrogators to trick him. They took away his books. They took away his paper and ink. He shut the blinds of his cell and sat in the dark. When the wares are gone, he joked, we may shut the shop windows. Finally, the state decided that if the law could not kill Thomas More, they would have to lie. Legal deadlock was unacceptable to a king who had already rewritten the laws of God to suit his marriage. If the silence of the prisoner could not be broken by threats, it would have to be shattered by betrayal. And so the machinery of the state turned its eyes toward a man with a pliable soul, ready to say the words that More would not. By the summer of 1535, the standoff between the king and his former chancellor had become untenable. Henry VIII was growing impatient. The execution of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, in late June had shocked Europe, but it had not moved Thomas More. The government realized that they could not break More's silence through intimidation. They needed a new tactic. If they could not extract a treasonous statement from him, they would have to manufacture one. The instrument of this betrayal was Richard Rich. Rich was the Solicitor General, a young, ambitious, and morally flexible lawyer who had been clawing his way up the greasy pole of Tudor politics. He was everything. More was not, opportunistic, cynical, and willing to do anything for power. Years before, More had known Rich as a young man and had warned him against his gambling and loose morals. Now, Rich would be his undoing. On June 12, 1535, Rich arrived at More's cell in the Tower. He claimed he was there merely to remove More's books and writing materials, depriving the prisoner of his last solace. As the packers were bundling up the books, Rich struck up a casual conversation with More. It was a trap, carefully rehearsed. Rich began with a hypothetical legal question. Admit that there were an act of Parliament that all the realm should take me for the king, Rich asked. Would not you, Master More, take me for king? Yes, sir, More replied, sensing no danger in a theoretical debate on parliamentary power. That would I, Rich pressed further. I put the case further. Admit there were an act of Parliament that all the realm should take me for Pope. Would not you then, Master More, take me for Pope? More saw the snare. He shifted the ground. He replied that Parliament had the power to meddle with the crowning of princes, but not with the crowning of popes, as that authority derived from God, not English law. It was a cautious, legally sound answer. But when Richard Rich left the Tower, he reported something very different. He claimed that during this conversation, Thomas More had explicitly stated that Parliament had no power to make the king the head of the church. It was the smoking gun the government needed. On July 1st, 1535, Thomas More was brought to Westminster Hall for trial. It was a place he knew intimately. He had presided there as Lord Chancellor, sitting on the marble chair of judgment. Now he stood in the dock. The scene was pitiful and grand all at once. More was dressed in a coarse wool gown, his face gaunt and yellowed from months of darkness, his beard long and gray. He was so weak from kidney stones and chest pains that he had to lean heavily on a staff. The judges, out of a shred of pity or perhaps embarrassment, allowed him to sit, a rare concession for a prisoner accused of treason. The indictment was read. It was long and complex, accusing him of maliciously, traitorously, and diabolically attempting to deprive the king of his title as supreme head of the church. More's defense was a masterpiece of legal intellect. Even in his weakened state, his mind was a diamond, sharp, clear, and unbreakable. He dismantled the prosecution's arguments one by one. To the charge that he had opposed the king's marriage, he replied that he had given his opinion only when commanded by the king to do so, and that a faithful adviser must speak the truth to his sovereign. To the charge of silence, he invoked the ancient maxim of the law, qui tace consentire videtur. He who keeps silent seems to consent. I have not been malicious, More argued, his voice quiet but carrying to the back of the hall. I have not done any act nor spoken any word against this statute, and for this silence, neither your law nor any law in the world is able justly and rightly to punish me. The court was stunned. The prosecution was faltering. More was winning. He was proving that he had navigated the impossible legal labyrinth without making a single misstep. Then the prosecution played its final card. They called Richard Rich to the stand. Rich took the oath on the holy evangelists. Then, looking straight at the man who had once mentored him, he lied. He testified that in the tower, More had plainly denied the king's supremacy. The courtroom fell silent. This was the moment. It was the word of a rising official against the word of a disgraced prisoner. More looked at Rich, not with anger, but with a terrible piercing pity. He struggled to his feet and delivered a rebuttal that devastated Rich's character for all of history. In good faith, Master Rich, More said, I am sorrier for your perjury than for my own peril. He turned to the judges and the jury. If this man says true, then I pray that I may never see the face of God. It was a terrifying oath for a man like More to swear. He continued dissecting Rich's past. He reminded the court that they had lived in the same parish for years. You were esteemed very light of your tongue, a great dicer and a gamester, and not of any commendable fame either there or in the temple. He asked the jury a simple question of logic. Why would he, Thomas More, who had refused to speak his mind to the king, the council, and the bishops for years, suddenly blurting out his darkest treason to a man like Richard Rich, a man he didn't even respect, while his books were being packed away? It made no sense. Can it therefore seem likely to your lordships, More asked, that I would, in so weighty a cause, so unadvisedly overshoot myself as to trust Master Rich? It was a brilliant defense. 2 other witnesses, men who had been packing the books during the conversation, were called, but they, perhaps fearing for their own souls or perhaps unwilling to commit perjury, claimed they had been too busy packing to hear the conversation. It didn't matter. The verdict had been decided before the trial began. The jury, terrified of the king's wrath, deliberated for only 15 minutes. Guilty. The word hung in the air like the tolling of a funeral bell. The Lord Chancellor, Thomas Audley, prepared to pass sentence immediately, but More interrupted him. He was a lawyer to the end. He reminded Audley that it was customary to ask the prisoner if he had any reason why judgment should not be passed. And then the silence finally broke. Having been convicted, More was a dead man. He had nothing left to lose. The caution, the legal maneuvering, the silence, it was all discarded. He stood up, and for the first time in 3 years, he spoke his full mind. He declared that the act of supremacy was directly repugnant to the laws of God and His holy church. He cited the Magna Carta, which guaranteed the freedom of the English church. He argued that England was but a small part of Christendom, and just as the City of London could not make a law against the Kingdom of England, so too the Kingdom of England could not make a law against the Universal Catholic Church. It was a speech of breathtaking courage. He was telling the judges, the jury, and the king himself that they were breaking the eternal law. The sentence was pronounced. He was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the traitor's death. The king would later commute this to beheading. As More left the hall, the axe was turned, the blade facing him, the symbol that he was condemned. But the true tragedy was yet to come. He was escorted by barge back to the Tower. At the Tower wharf, a crowd had gathered. Among them was Margaret Roper. She had been waiting for hours. When she saw her father, gaunt and surrounded by guards with halberds, she lost all control. She pushed through the crowd. She fought past the soldiers, disregarding their weapons, driven by a primal grief. She ran to him and threw her arms around his neck, sobbing uncontrollably. She could not speak. She could only cry out, "Oh, my father! Oh, my father!" More, though weak, stood firm. He held her. He blessed her. He tried to comfort her, telling her it was God's will. She pulled away, but then, unable to leave him, she turned back. She ran to him a second time, clinging to him, kissing him again and again, as if she could physically hold him back from death. The scene was so heartbreaking that even the guards, hardened men who had seen hundreds of prisoners die, began to weep openly. It was the dance of death of a father and daughter who had shared one soul. Finally, they were separated. More was led back to the darkness of the bell tower. The last few days were a time of preparation. He sent his hair shirt to Margaret. He would no longer need to mortify his flesh. The executioner would do that for him. He wrote his final letter to her with a piece of charcoal. It is a letter of almost unbearable tenderness. "I never liked your manner toward me better than when you kissed me last," he wrote, absolving her of any shame for her public display of grief. He sent blessings to all his children. He was ready. On the morning of July 6, 1535, the end came. Thomas More, dressed in his finest clothes, sending a gold coin to the executioner. The king, petty to the end, ordered him to change into a plain gray gown. More obeyed. He walked to Tower Hill. The crowd was immense. The scaffold was high and rickety. We return now to that opening image, the frail man climbing the steps. The joke to the lieutenant, "See me safe up." The kiss of forgiveness for the executioner. He was forbidden from making a long speech. The king feared his eloquence, so he kept it brief. He asked the people to pray for him and to bear witness that he died in and for the faith of the Holy Catholic Church. "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." He knelt. He recited the psalm, "Miserere mei, Deus, have mercy on me, O God." He placed his head on the block. He moved his beard. "This hath not offended the king." The axe rose. It hovered for a second in the summer sun, a flash of steel against the blue sky. Then, with a dull thud that resonated through the history of England, it fell. The head of Thomas More rolled into the straw. But the story did not end with the stroke of the axe. The king had killed the man, but in doing so, he had birthed a ghost that would haunt the conscience of the West for centuries. The immediate aftermath, however, was not concerned with ghosts, but with the brutal realities of treason. As the blood was scrubbed from the scaffold, the king's men moved quickly to desecrate the remains, hoping to turn a martyr into a monster and erase his defiance from the public memory. The body of the former Lord Chancellor was handled with the rough efficiency of the execution grounds. It was bundled into a plain coffin and buried swiftly in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, within the walls of the tower. This was the graveyard of the condemned, where More now lay alongside the very men he had once judged. But it was the head that mattered. By the king's command, Thomas More's head was parboiled, boiled in water to preserve it and prevent it from rotting too quickly. It was then impaled on a tall wooden pike and set atop London Bridge. This was the Traitor's Gate of the city, a place where the hollow eyes of dead rebels stared down at the merchants and travelers entering London. For a month, the head of the greatest scholar in England, the man Erasmus called a soul purer than snow, blackened in the summer sun, a grotesque trophy of the king's supremacy. It was intended to inspire fear. Instead, it inspired a legend of love and defiance that has outlasted the bridge itself. Margaret Roper, the daughter who had clung to him on the wharf, was not finished. She was a woman of extraordinary courage, possessing a steel will that matched her father's. She could not bear the thought of his head being thrown into the Thames to be eaten by fish, which was the custom when the next traitor's head arrived to take its place. According to tradition, Margaret returned to the bridge under the cover of darkness. She bribed the executioner or the keeper of the bridge, a man who perhaps had enough humanity left to be bought. Just as the head was about to be discarded, she caught it. She took it home. She preserved it with spices and kept it with her for the rest of her life. It is said she kept it in a lead box, and when she died 9 years later, she was buried with the head of her father resting in her arms. It is a macabre image, yes, but it is also one of the most powerful symbols of loyalty in history. It signifies that while the state can claim the body, love reclaims the person. But while love reclaimed the victim, a slow-moving curse seemed to consume the judges. The head was taken down from the bridge, but the blood spilled that day seemed to seep into the very foundations of the Tudor dynasty. History has a strange way of balancing the scales, and for those who conspired to kill the man for all seasons, the years that followed were not filled with peace, but with paranoia and blood. Anne Boleyn, the woman whose ambition had necessitated More's death, enjoyed her triumph for less than a year. It was for her sake that Henry had broken the church. It was for her sake that he had beheaded his friend. She had won, but her victory was built on sand. She failed to give Henry the one thing he demanded, a son. When she miscarried a male child in January 1536, on the very day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, her fate was sealed. Cruelly, Henry used the very same machinery of treason against her that she had encouraged against More. On May 19, 1536, less than a year after More's death, Anne Boleyn walked to her own scaffold on Tower Green. She was beheaded by a French swordsman. It is said that as she awaited death, she laughed hysterically. One wonders if, in those final moments, the image of Thomas More, the man who had refused to acknowledge her crown, flashed before her eyes. Then there was Thomas Cromwell, the blacksmith's son, the administrative genius, the man who had orchestrated the legal trap that caught More. For 5 years after More's death, Cromwell was the master of England. He dissolved the monasteries, enriching the king beyond his wildest dreams. He revolutionized the government. He seemed untouchable, but the wheel of fortune in Henry's court never stopped turning. In 1540, Cromwell made a fatal mistake. He arranged a marriage for Henry to Anne of Cleves, a German princess the king found physically repulsive. Henry turned on him with the speed of a striking cobra. Cromwell was arrested. He was taken to the Tower, to the same walls that had held More. Unlike More, who had faced death with stoic calm and wit, Cromwell panicked. He wrote desperate, pleading letters to the king, begging for mercy, mercy, mercy. It did him no good. On July 28, 1540, Cromwell was beheaded. But unlike More, who died with one clean stroke, Cromwell's death was a butchery. The executioner was inexperienced and nervous. It took 3 horrific blows to sever the head. And finally, Henry VIII himself. The Golden Prince who had walked in the garden with More, his arm around his neck. Henry lived for another 12 years after More's execution. He married 4 more times. He grew obese, he paranoid, and tyrannous. His leg ulcerated, causing him constant, agonizing pain that permeated the entire palace with a smell of decay. He became a lonely, terrifying figure, haunting his own corridors. He had surrounded himself with yes-men, having killed the only man who dared to tell him the truth. It is recorded that in his final years, Henry would sometimes lapse into melancholy, regretting the deaths of the men who had served him best, Wolsey, Cromwell, and More. When Henry died in 1547, he left behind a kingdom that was religiously divided, financially nearly ruined, and ruled by a child. The imperial power he had sought by breaking with Rome had come at a terrible cost to his own soul. When the news of More's death first crossed the Channel, Europe gasped. This was not just a local English political purge. This was the execution of a European celebrity. The Emperor Charles V, upon hearing the news, turned to the English ambassador and said, "If we had been master of such a servant, we would rather have lost the best city of our dominions than to have lost such a worthy counselor." Erasmus, old and sick in Switzerland, was devastated. In More's death, he wrote, "I seem to have died myself, for we had but one soul between us." The Republic of Letters, the network of humanists and scholars that connected the continent, went into mourning. Henry VIII, realizing he had perhaps gone too far, went on the defensive. He sent diplomats to foreign courts to explain that More had been a traitor who conspired against the crown, but the stain would not wash out. Henry had killed the one man in his kingdom who was universally acknowledged to be incorruptible. From that moment on, the golden sheen of Henry's reign was tarnished forever. He was no longer the Renaissance prince. He was the tyrant. For the next 400 years, the memory of Thomas More became a battlefield. To the Catholic faithful, he was instantly a martyr. Relics of his life, his hair shirt, his rosary, his letters, were smuggled out of England and venerated. Biographies were written that painted him as a perfect, flawless saint, a man who walked through the fire of persecution with a smile. But in Protestant England, a different story took root. To the Elizabethan chroniclers, like John Foxe, author of the famous Book of Martyrs, More was a villain. They remembered him not as the victim, but as the victimizer. They pointed to the heretics burned under his watch. They painted him as a cruel, masochistic fanatic who whipped beggars and hunted down Bible translators with a terrifying zeal. This duality is the central problem of Thomas More. Which one is the real man? The answer, uncomfortable as it is that both were the real man. We cannot understand More if we try to split him in half. He was a humanist who loved Greek philosophy, believed in education for women, and wrote of a utopia with religious tolerance. Yet, he was also a medieval man who believed that heresy was a poison that would destroy the soul of society. He feared that if the Catholic Church fell, civilization would collapse into violence and anarchy. Looking at the religious wars, that tore Europe apart in the century after his death, one could argue his fears were not entirely unfounded. He was a man of deep contradictions. He wore velvet and gold on the outside, but rough horsehair on the inside. He loved the world, yet he spent his life preparing to leave it. He was a lawyer who used the law to kill heretics and then used the law to try and save himself, only to die because the law was broken by a king. In the 20th and 21st centuries, our view of More has shifted again, largely defined by two great works of art. First came Robert Bolt's play and film, A Man for All Seasons, 1960/1966. This is the More most of us know, the gentle, witty, saintly hero of selfhood. In this version, More is a modern liberal saint, a man dying for the rights of conscience and the privacy of the individual against the encroaching state. He is the ultimate hero of integrity. But more recently, Hilary Mantel's novel Wolf Hall gave us the negative image. In her version, More is a rigid, sneering, misogynistic religious fundamentalist, while his nemesis Thomas Cromwell is the pragmatic, forward-thinking hero. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the gray space between the halo and the whip. Thomas More was not a modern liberal. He did not die for freedom of speech or freedom of religion in the way we understand those terms today. He would have been horrified by the idea that everyone has a right to their own truth. He died for the truth, the objective, universal truth of the Catholic Church. He died because he believed the king was lying, and he could not force his soul to participate in that lie. So why does he still matter? Why do we still tell the story of the old man and the beard on the block? He matters because he drew a line. We live in an age of flexibility. We are taught to compromise, to adapt, to go along to get along. We are constantly pressured to align our internal beliefs with external expectations, whether from our employers, our political parties, or our social circles. Thomas More represents the terrifying, beautiful absolute. He represents the idea that there is a part of the human self that cannot be bought, sold, or bullied. He called it his conscience, but he described it physically. He said that if he swore the oath against his conscience, he would be holding his soul in his hands and letting it fall to the ground like water. Once spilled, it could never be gathered up again. He showed us that the self is something you build, brick by brick, through your choices. And he showed us that there are some prices that are too high to pay for survival. In 1935, 400 years after his head was stuck on that pike, the Catholic Church canonized him as a saint. In 2000, Pope John Paul II declared him the patron saint of statesmen and politicians. A gentle irony, given that politics killed him. But you don't need to be a Catholic to be moved by his end. You only need to be human. When Thomas More stood on that scaffold, frail and shivering, he was not just a defeated politician. He was a man who had succeeded in the hardest task of all. He had remained himself. As he knelt down, moving his beard aside because it had committed no treason, he gave us one last lesson. He showed us that even in the face of death, you can keep your wit, you can keep your style, and you can keep your soul. He was and remains the King's good servant, but God's first. The story of Thomas More is not just a biography of a man. It is a mirror held up to power. It asks us a question that is as relevant in 2025 as it was in 1535. What is the price of your soul? For Thomas More, the price was his head, and he paid it gladly. In the end, we are left with the image of the two men, Henry VIII, the king who had everything, wealth, women, absolute power, who died rotting and unhappy, and Thomas More, the prisoner who had nothing, no property, no liberty, no life, who died with a joke on his lips and peace in his heart. Who really was the free man?